The views expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect those of this station.
Welcome to Insights into Northeast Michigan, a WBKB News public affairs program. Insights deals with the issues affecting those in the community as well as Northeast Michigan and the state. And now, Insights into Northeast Michigan.
Welcome to another Insights. I'm Lauren Mixon, and today I am here with Andrea Mills of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and she's going to be talking to us about invasive species in the Great Lakes. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Andrea.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Of course. So invasive species are a problem a lot of people may not know about. If you're not out on the water, if you're not a fisherman, a lot of people may not think about species in the Great Lakes or invasive species or just what's in the water in general. But this is a really big thing and a big problem that we're having in the Great Lakes right now. If you could talk to me a little bit about that.
Sure, you're absolutely right, Lauren. Invasive species are one of the world's greatest threats to biodiversity. And in the Great Lakes, we have over 180 non-native species that are living in the Great Lakes. Now, a non-native species is slightly different from an invasive species. An invasive species would actually be worse. So an invasive species is a species that has established in a new ecosystem. In this case, we're talking about the Great Lakes. And that's enough to label it non-native. But to actually be called an invasive species, that species has to cause some kind of harm. Mm-hmm. And that harm could either be economic harm, and it can also be, and typically is, environmental harm. Right. So having negative effects on the food web. And so in the Great Lakes, we have a variety of invasive species, and I've brought a few examples today if you'd like to see them.
Yeah, so if you could tell us a little bit about what invasive species are really common in the Great Lakes that we're seeing right now.
Sure. One of the ones that is most common that many people have heard of would be the zebra and quagga mussels. The zebra and quagga mussels are organisms that came to the Great Lakes from the Ponto-Caspian region of Eastern Europe and Russia. What these guys do, they're fairly small, but they've had big effects on the Great Lakes. These mussels have come in, they establish across the bottom of the Great Lakes, and then they filter feed. And they have done a marvelous job of basically filtering out the majority of the nutrients and the microorganisms that are living in the Great Lakes. So the water in the Great Lakes has become considerably more clear because of the invasion of the zebra and the quagga mussels, but unfortunately that's actually a very bad thing. Clear water means water that has very few nutrients and organisms in it to feed the food web. And so by invading, these mussel species have actually wiped out the base of the food web, and because it's the foundation of the food web, that can literally affect almost every other single organism that exists in the Great Lakes. So these invasive mussels have had very big effects on the Great Lakes. And many people would probably know these because their dead shells will wash up on the shores, and it's pretty easy to cut your feet on them if you're not careful when you're walking. Yeah, so these have caused many problems. Another invasive species, while we're talking about small invaders, another one would be the spiny water fleas. Some people also call them by their scientific name, which is Bythotrephes. Quite small. They're less than ½ an inch long, but they've also had big effects. Right. These sit at the middle of the food web. These little critters are a type of invertebrate. They're a type of zooplankton, and they eat other zooplankton. Now, what zooplankton are is they are the aquatic invertebrates that many young fish, the larval fish, rely on early on in their life. Most young fish eat zooplankton for at least a few months after they're born, and that is how these spiny water fleas are causing harm. The spiny water fleas compete with young fish over zooplankton as prey, and unfortunately these spiny water fleas are far more numerous than the young fish are, and so these spiny water fleas outcompete young fish in the Great Lakes. And unfortunately, if you look closely, this tiny little body has a really long spine for its size.
It does.
More than half of the body length of a spiny water flea is devoted to a long spine, and that's protection. This long spine keeps young fish from being able to eat the spiny water fleas. Yeah. So not only do these spiny water fleas compete with young fish, they also do not serve as a useful food resource. Right. So again, these little creatures are having some pretty big effects in the Great Lakes.
So let's go back to the zebra and quagga mussels really quickly, because I've heard a little bit about those and some of the harmful effects that they have even on boaters. Could you talk to me about that really quickly?
Yes, so these zebra and quagga mussels can grow on a variety of surfaces. One of them would be the hulls of boats, and they also grow on pilings, docks that are in the water. Unfortunately, they can also grow on the screens that cover the intakes for many municipal water supplies, so they can be very challenging because they can clog water supplies. And like we said, they grow on boats. They can also infest or grow on the motors of boats. And that's an important bit of information, because one of the ways that zebra and quagga mussels can be spread from one system, one lake, to another is when a boat has some zebra or quagga mussels that are growing on it or have attached to the boat motor, and then that boat moves to a new ecosystem, to a new lake. Those zebra and quagga mussels could drop off and start a new population in the new system. And so one of the best things that people can do to prevent the spread of zebra and quagga mussels, as well as many other invasive species, is to wash off the outside, the hulls of boats, as well as the motors, and empty live wells as well on boats, because these little creatures can get inside the live wells. There's a young stage called a veliger. That's what the larval, essentially, zebra and quagga mussel is called. That stage is planktonic, meaning it floats in the water, and it could very easily get inside a live well, and it could also establish a population elsewhere. So clean all of those parts of the boat out that I mentioned, make sure they're free of zebra and quagga mussels, and then it's safe to move on to a new system, new lake.
That is a lot that a lot of people may not have known about. Now I see one more thing down here, and that looks like the big head carp. Could you talk to me a little bit about that one?
Sure, and I'll bring over my example. So this is just a little big head carp. So big head carp are one species of 4 species of Asian carp that are threatening invasion into the Great Lakes. The 4 species would be big head carp, silver carp, grass carp, and black carp. Big head is one of the better known species. The other one that's very well known would be the silver carp. And they're well known because if they end up in the Great Lakes, and I certainly hope they do not, and many people are working very hard to keep these carp species out of the Great Lakes, but if they were to end up in the Great Lakes, they could cause enormous harm. This big head carp right here is only a few months old. This is a young big head carp. It could reach over 90 pounds, maybe even over 100 pounds when it is full grown. What this fish does is it feeds on the plankton in the water column, so the microscopic animals and plants such as the zooplankton we mentioned earlier, as well as algae that lives in the water. And again, those form the base of the food web, and so by filtering out the zooplankton and the phytoplankton, they can have negative effects on other fish, other organisms that are living in those systems.
Wow, well that is definitely a lot to learn about. I had no idea there were this many invasive species, and this is just a few of them.
Correct.
So thank you, Andrea, for telling us about these invasive species. That was very interesting, and we'll have more insights when we come back. Welcome back to Insights. I'm Lauren Mixon, and I'm here with Andrea Mills of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. Today we are talking about invasive species in the Great Lakes, and right now we're taking a look at sea lamprey, one of the most prominent invasive species in the Great Lakes. So let's kind of talk about that and what they're doing and how they got here.
Sure. So I mentioned earlier that there are over 180 non-native species in the Great Lakes. And of those 180, only 2 of them are actually controlled. The 2 invasive species that are controlled are the sea lamprey and the alewife. Now, sea lamprey are one of the single most devastating, if not the most devastating invasive species to have ever come into the Great Lakes. And they're also one of the invasive species that we've been living with the longest. They first invaded in the 1860s into Lake Ontario, and then by the 1920s they had spread into Lake Erie, and by the late 1930s they had invaded all of the other Great Lakes. So there's no better way to meet a sea lamprey than to actually get up close and personal. So I'm going to pull out a real live sea lamprey right now. So the sea lamprey are a little wily.
They are. They're a little squirmy.
They're a little squirmy. I have a 4-year-old at home, and I would say they're about as squirmy as a little kid, which is saying something. So this is a sea lamprey. Now this is a little one. I grabbed the little one just to help make everyone a bit more comfortable. So this is a full-grown adult lamprey. Lamprey are basically vampire fish. What they do is they are a type of parasite that attaches to other fish and then they use their mouth, which is like basically a suction cup with teeth, almost 150 teeth in a sea lamprey's mouth. They suck onto the side of a fish, and then they take their tongue. So right in the center of the mouth is a sea lamprey's tongue.
Yes.
That tongue is lined with teeth, and they'll use that toothed tongue to lick or lash a hole through the side of the fish. And then once they've made that hole, out comes the blood and the other bodily fluids of the fish.
Oh, that sounds so scary.
They are pretty horrifying, and they are pretty scary. If you were a fish, you should be terrified of sea lamprey
Yes.
because they are so harmful. These sea lamprey, each sea lamprey can kill about 40 pounds of fish during its life. And before we could control sea lamprey in the Great Lakes, there were about 2.5 million sea lamprey swimming around in the Great Lakes. With each one killing 40 pounds of fish, that is 100 million pounds of fish that was dying every single year due to sea lamprey invading the Great Lakes. And it was catastrophic to the Great Lakes ecosystem. I think we'll get this sea lamprey back in the tank unless you'd like to touch or hold the sea lamprey right now.
You gave me a glove, so I committed to holding it. So
Fantastic.
we'll see if I can hold it without it getting
Sure, there you go.
too squirmy. So yeah, it doesn't have any bones, correct?
Correct, it has a cartilaginous skeleton. It's not a bony fish. It also doesn't have a jaw. That's one of the other distinctions to sea lampreys, that they are jawless, and they are very ancient. The lamprey lineage is over 360 million years old, so they're far older than the dinosaurs.
Oh, wow.
In fact, they've actually survived the 4 mass extinction events, 4 major mass extinction events that have occurred through time. The lamprey have survived it.
That is very interesting. I did not know that. So I'm actually going to hand this back to you because
Okay.
it looks like this one is ready to go.
So I will tell one last thing. We'll get this one back into the tank. We'll give
Okay.
it a break, and I'm going to pull out one of the bigger ones.
Okay.
Here we go. Start small and move our way up.
Yes.
So one of the key things about sea lamprey that everyone needs to know, while they are deadly to fish, they are not harmful directly to people. Sea lamprey do not attack people. So always keep that in mind. You should never be concerned about swimming anywhere in the Great Lakes because of sea lamprey. They will not attack people. The exception, though, is that if you were to stick something in front of a sea lamprey's mouth, they will attach. Whether it's this beautiful table here, they've attached to that, or if you stick a hand in front of a lamprey's mouth, it will attach.
Okay.
But I'm not nervous about this lamprey attaching because it's not trying to drink my blood. It's not trying to rip a hole through my hand with its tongue.
Right.
All it's doing is attaching simply because it's something that the sea lamprey naturally do.
Right.
Essentially for a lamprey, it's sink, swim, or suck. Unless they're actively swimming out in a lake or they have sucked onto something like a fish, they'll always tend to sink. And so if given the opportunity, they will attach to something simply to maintain their position in the water. But if you were to come across a sea lamprey while swimming, that lamprey will avoid you.
Okay.
So
Good to
never
know.
fear sea lamprey in the water in terms of having a lamprey attached to you. But there are many good reasons that people should fear, so to speak, or not be happy about sea lamprey in the Great Lakes because of all the harm that lamprey do to fisheries.
Yes, definitely. Now, you did bring some examples of the life cycle of a sea lamprey. So let's talk about those.
Sure. So each female sea lamprey can produce anywhere from 60,000 to 100,000 eggs. And what is in the jar here would be all of the eggs from a single female sea lamprey. It's an enormous amount of eggs for such a small organism to produce. Now, of course, not all of those 60,000 or 100,000 eggs would survive. We think it's about 10% across the board on average throughout the Great Lakes. So that still means 6,000 to 10,000 new lamprey for every single male and female that find each other in the Great Lakes and mate. And unfortunately, sea lamprey are actually very good at finding potential mates. You might not guess it, but the sea lamprey has a tremendous sense of smell. It's about 100 times better than even a German shepherd.
Wow.
They can smell out, they can sniff out other lamprey from miles away. And so the males and females in particular are very good at sniffing each other out, finding each other, and then mating. And so all it takes is just a few adult sea lamprey, at least one male and one female, to reach the same area. They can find each other, reproduce, these eggs develop, and then a population can be established. The adults die after spawning, which is a good thing, so they spawn only once in their life. These eggs, of course, live on. After about 2 weeks, Those eggs will hatch and out pop many thousands of larval sea lamprey. These sea lamprey are just a few months old. They're probably 2 or 3 months old at this point. They're about the size of a grain of rice. This spawning I haven't mentioned yet. The spawning of sea lamprey occurs in streams, and their young life stages live in streams for about the first 5 years of their life. So as a larvae, they form burrows in the bottom of the stream. After about 3 to 4 years, they're about the size of a green bean. And about a year later than this, the sea lamprey goes through a special change in its life called a metamorphosis. Now, prior to the metamorphosis, these sea lamprey are essentially totally harmless. They only filter feed. So they filter the microorganisms from the water. They do not harm fish. It's the metamorphosis when the sea lamprey become harmful. During their metamorphosis, they gain their eyes, and they gain fully developed fins, and most importantly, they gain that mouth with all of those teeth.
Right.
And so this is what a newly metamorphosed parasitic sea lamprey looks like.
Oh, wow.
So at this point, it is ready to leave the stream it was born in and go out into a lake and begin feeding on fish. Now, if there's ever a stage that is modestly cute for a sea lamprey, I think it's this stage, because it's just like a miniature version of the adult. But even at this stage, they are cold-blooded killers. And cold-blooded because they are a type of fish, so they are cold-blooded, and killers because this small sea lamprey now is lethal.
Right.
And it will kill about 40 pounds of fish over the next year to a year and a half of its life. And at the end of that year to a year and a half, they will have grown into the size of an adult. And then they will pick a stream to spawn in, and the cycle will repeat itself.
Well, it looks like these are definitely causing some problems, which we're going to touch on that a little bit more when we come back.
Great.
And we'll be right back with more insights. Welcome back to Insights. I am here with Andrea Mills of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and today we are talking about invasive species, and we are talking about sea lamprey in particular. We talked a little bit about what they do already, and we know they are parasites. So we know that they're impacting the other fish in the Great Lakes, and that's having an economic impact on the area. So let's talk about that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure. When sea lamprey invaded in the 1800s and early 1900s, the fisheries that were going on in the Great Lakes were one of the most valuable components of the economy. And sea lamprey utterly devastated fisheries, and so they devastated economies across the entire Great Lakes region. The main fish that sea lamprey attacked was the lake trout. Lake trout are large fish that are a perfect prey resource, a perfect host fish for sea lamprey, but they were also very valuable economically. Many people fished for them. Whitefish and burbot were two other species that sea lamprey were very harmful to, and those species also supported fisheries. And so after the sea lamprey invaded, there was economic ruin in many communities that relied upon fish species. And so there was a public outcry that resulted across the Great Lakes that ultimately led to the formation of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and also the establishment of Hammond Bay Biological Station, which is in northeastern Michigan near Rogers City. That is where I am stationed for my work. At Hammond Bay Biological Station, the researchers got busy and began developing control methods for sea lamprey. It all started in the early 1950s, and that great work has continued right through today. And so despite all of the economic harm that sea lamprey have caused, they are one of the greatest success stories now in the Great Lakes, because sea lamprey are under control. We have been able to reduce their populations by 90% since they first invaded the Great Lakes. It's one of the best control programs anywhere in the world for an invasive species, and it all started just near Rogers City in northeastern Michigan.
Wow, well, that's a good story that's close to home. So let's talk a little bit about how they are controlled. What methods are used to keep these, at a minimum?
Sure. So the main way we control lamprey is by applying what's called a lampricide. Here is an example of a lampricide. It is a type of pesticide, but we call it a lampricide specifically because it is selective to killing lamprey species without harming other fish and wildlife populations, which is a really incredible story that these lampricides were discovered. In the 1950s at Hammond Bay Biological Station, the biologists there tested over 6,500 different chemical compounds, typically at 2 2 or 3 different concentrations. It was over 20,000 different tests that were run. And of all that work, they discovered 2 chemical compounds that were selective, that were lethal to sea lamprey, but not harmful to other fish and wildlife. And so really an incredible story of hard work and perseverance leading to the development of a control method which has now kept lamprey populations in check and has allowed Great Lakes fisheries to rebound. Our fisheries are currently valued at over $7 billion annually, and much of the reason that we do have vital fisheries now is because sea lamprey are controlled. So lampricides are the backbone of our control program, but they're not the only control method that we use. I should mention these lampricides target the larval life stage, so the young sea lamprey that are living in streams before they've ever harmed fish.
Right.
Another life stage that we target with our control program would be the adult stage, what we see here with this model and in the tank. When adults move into streams to spawn, we deny them access to good spawning habitat by putting in barriers. Sea lamprey are horrible jumpers. They can't make it over a height more than about 1.5 feet. So it only takes a very small barrier, and you can block the entire sea lamprey population, the entire spawning adult population as it moves into a stream. But fortunately, some fish are still able to jump over those barriers. And so the sea lamprey, though, once they've been blocked by a barrier, they don't give up on spawning. They will spawn between the barrier and the lake that they came from, but then our crews go out and treat that area of the stream with lampricides. So barriers and lampricides work hand in hand. And the final thing we do is we trap the adult sea lamprey. Once they've been blocked by a barrier, we typically have traps in many streams throughout the Great Lakes. Those sea lamprey eventually work their way into the trap, and then we remove them from the Great Lakes before they spawn.
Wow, who knew all of this was happening under the water? And it's such a big deal that you know, a lot of people may not know about. So like I was saying before, it is crucial to fishermen. And what are some of the things that we can do to look out for those? Are there anything anglers should be doing in particular or looking out for when they're out fishing?
So there is not much that people can do in terms of their day-to-day activities while out fishing to help the sea lamprey control program. It is very rare for fishermen to encounter a sea lamprey these days, and that's a good thing. That's because we've reduced their populations by 90%, so that's fantastic. But the most important thing is that people are supportive of funding for invasive species control in the Great Lakes, supporting of programs such as the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and others that goes to fund research on the development of novel new control methods for sea lamprey as well as other invasive species. And then of course education. Tell your friends, tell your families what you've learned about sea lamprey and other invasive species so people are aware that invasive species are a problem and that sea lamprey specifically are still out in the Great Lakes and that control for sea lamprey must continue. We've learned from experience that if we let our foot off the gas with sea lamprey control, their populations will begin to rebound. So it is essential that we continue to control sea lamprey populations into the future in order to protect our very valuable fisheries in the Great Lakes.
Absolutely. So for people who are committed to the cause and maybe want to contribute to research or helping develop more lampricides or other chemical compounds that are going to help with the Great Lakes, how do they go about reaching out and making those contributions?
And so most of our research in the sea lamprey control program is conducted by researchers by the U.S. Geological Survey stationed at Hammond Bay Biological Station. Though that is our primary research team, but we do have others working at universities such as Michigan State University. There are multiple labs there that do fantastic cutting-edge work on developing control methods for sea lamprey and just helping us understand the life cycle of sea lamprey in greater depth, and also trying to develop some control methods that might be related to genetics. So there's a big team of people that are out there working to develop new control methods, but if you do have an idea for a control method, feel free to reach out to the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. We have a website, it's sealamprey.org, and we're also on social media. We're on Facebook and Twitter. We're at Lamprey Control.
Well, thank you so much. I learned so much today. I had no idea that the sea lamprey were such a big deal, but I think everybody just learned so much today. This has been awesome. Thank you, Andrea, for coming in for another Insights. We'll see you next time.
Insights into Northeast Michigan is produced by WBKB News. If you have any comments, suggestions, or topics you would like to see on a future show, please email WBKB News. This has been a production of Thunder Bay Broadcasting Corporation. All rights reserved.